Greetings and welcome to another lecture on psychopathology. This particular lecture involving the substance-related disorders involves opiates. Now, opiates are so called because they're originally derived from the opium poppy. Opium poppies grow wild in Asia and other places and have indeed been cultivated by humans for quite a while because of these properties that the opiates have. Specifically, opiates are used for pain relief. These opiates, also sometimes called the exogenous opiates, bind to receptor sites in our bodies, which are used by the endogenous opiates, the opiates our bodies make itself. And these opiate receptors are used to relieve pain. And they can also cause a feeling of euphoria, a feeling of giddiness, of happiness, particularly when they're not being used to relieve pain. It's really rather interesting in that for the most part that when people are taking opiates when they're in pain, they don't really become dependent. There's a lot less of a chance that you're going to become dependent on opiates if you're taking them for pain relief than if you're taking them recreationally. The way to get around this, unfortunately, is that people need to stop taking the opiates before the pain goes away. Because if they continue to take the opiates until there is no more pain, or they just take them regularly for however long, it's quite possible the body will switch from using those opiates for pain relief over to using those opiates to get high. My mother has had both of her knees replaced, and she was on opiates usually for a short time after the replacement, and then they would switch her on to essentially acetaminophen, Tylenol. She didn't like that, needless to say, because the acetaminophen didn't kill the pain as easily as the opiates did. But even though she was on a relatively high dose of opiates for a fairly good period of time, she did not become at all dependent on them. So it really seems to have something to do with using for pain versus using for fun. Now, people can abuse or use, for that matter, opiates in a number of different ways. Opiates can be swallowed in the form of pills, they can be smoked, and they also can be injected. And a lot of opiate use is injection because it tends to be the one that happens fastest, with smoking comes second and ingesting being a rather distant third. And when these drugs are injected, they cause basically, as this says, a 60-second rush where it just that feeling of euphoria, it's like being washed over by a wave, followed by 4 to 6 hours of relaxation and a diminished but still apparently very pleasant feeling of euphoria. I say apparently pleasant because I know that when I've taken them for pain relief, that they don't necessarily affect my mood any. They do make me sleep, but they don't necessarily affect my mood, although I have to say I haven't taken them for fun. But at any rate, physiological dependence can happen with, it depends on the person, but in general, if the opiates are used for 30 days daily, then there's a very good chance you're going to get dependence. Now, psychological dependence can happen a lot faster. And if a person is taking a lot of the opiates, it's quite possible that they could become dependent faster. It's all individual differences, the same as it was in the earlier lecture for alcohol. It really depends on the person and their particular circumstances. But once a person becomes physically dependent, then withdrawal usually starts about 8 hours without the drug. So when you think about it, people then who are dependent on opiates are probably going to need 2 to 3 doses a day baseline. And when you add intolerance, you can see how this could very rapidly get out of control. Now, withdrawal from opiates is notoriously unpleasant. Chilling, people get chills, people get flushed, vomiting, diarrhea, cramps, pain. One of the things the body does when it is supplied with a near continuous supply of those exogenous opiates like heroin and oxycodone and fentanyl and such like, is that it will stop producing its own endogenous opiates. That's where the tolerance comes in. And so you need to have more basically to get the same effect. And since opiates are used for pain relief, very often one of the things that starts to happen when people withdraw from them is that everything starts to hurt, to the point of sometimes there's delirium and hallucinations. Now, opiate withdrawal is not nearly as likely to kill you as alcohol withdrawal is. It's not pleasant, but it's a bit less lethal. The symptoms start to decline by the fourth day and are generally gone by the seventh. And any urges to take opiates after that are psychological. Doesn't mean they're easier to resist. In fact, they might be harder. Long-term use of opiates is very dangerous. It can damage the body in terms of, if nothing else, if it's injection in terms of problems with injection sites or people sharing needles or that sort of thing. Also, it's a depressant. Well, it's not a depressant, it's an opiate, but it acts much the same as a depressant. And in fact, one of the ways that people overdose in this is that they simply stop breathing. And that is when, for instance, Narcan might be used. What Narcan is it's a drug that is an opiate antagonist, which means that Narcan bonds to the same receptor sites that the opiates do, but it doesn't give the same effect. It doesn't give the same sort of feeling of euphoria and stuff, even though it does bond with the receptor sites. And in fact, people who are dependent on opiates don't particularly like taking Narcan because they basically sober up instantly, which is good for saving their lives, but it isn't good for the fact that the withdrawal symptoms then tend to kick in. Here's a chart. It's from 2017 data, which is probably about as recent data as we're going to get, where we have roughly 1,300 people a day dying from opiate-related overdoses in the U.S., 1.4 million prescribed prescription opioids, a lot more abuse non-prescription opioids. In fact, a number of people will switch to things like heroin because in some ways it's cheaper and easier to get than prescription pills are. Now that a lot of the pill mills, as they were called, that were in places like Florida have been closed. Used to be that people would doctor shop and you could talk to somebody over the phone for 10 minutes and they would give you a prescription for opiates and fill that prescription. A lot of people made a lot of money and a lot of people died because of it. But you could see that it's a fairly significant number of people that are being hurt. You don't need to know these numbers, by the way. They will not show up on the test. I probably should have told you that first. Causal factors in addiction. Some of these are the same that you're going to get in, for instance, alcohol addiction. Some of it is, this is how it tends to be summed up: pleasure, curiosity, and peer pressure. Pleasure, because taking opiates recreationally apparently feels really, really good. Curiosity, because people want to know what it's like. They've heard about other people taking it, and they're curious. And peer pressure, because if friends are using it, very often they will encourage their own friends to use it. Sometimes with a sort of a baser underlying reason, things like, well, then they can sell to their friends. Who knows? But yeah. There are neural bases, as I said, for physiological dependence. I mentioned this earlier, which is essentially that the opiates replace the endogenous opiates. Except endogenous opiates can take a little bit of time to kick in and to work, but these exogenous opiates work very, very fast and very, very intensely. So when people are taking things for a rush, this is what they go for. By the way, if you've ever heard of the runner's high, people run, 10, 12 miles and all of a sudden they really start to feel good. Those are the endogenous opiates kicking in. There's also something called the reward deficiency syndrome that may cause some people to be a bit more likely to develop dependence. There may be some people that their reward pathways, whether it's the pathway that we talked about in terms of alcohol or other reward pathways, are simply not as sensitive. So they need to get a much higher, more intense stimulation in order for them to get that feeling of pleasure. So instead of going with sort of the normal things that give people pleasure, that activate that, they have to go for the big guns. And they do that by going for things like opiates. Again, like a lot of the other abuse disorders, we're talking lots of comorbidity. Along with other substance abuse, people very often will take several different types of drugs instead of just one in order to get pleasure, trauma that might cause them to want to keep using the drug, and also, quite frankly, it might go along with having been injured and using the drug for too long. Now, the treatment for opium dependence is in some ways similar to alcohol in that the first thing to do is detox. The first thing to do before trying to treat the dependence is to get the person off the drug and let their body have a chance to recover. Now, as I mentioned, opiate detox is notoriously awful, although it doesn't tend to be particularly deadly. It's still not particularly fun. So it may take a while. As you can see, the physical symptoms are gone in a week. So you're usually going to give people a week or two to detox before you're going to start working on the psychological dependence. Now, the simple thing, which is basically, okay, we'll detox you, and then we'll put you back into the community and tell you not to use, needless to say, doesn't work very well. Because people are very, very likely, particularly if they haven't worked on the reasons that they started using in the first place, people are very, very likely to then essentially start using again for whatever reason that they started to use in the first place. Another thing that is done is to essentially take the use of the opiates and instead substitute it with another drug, specifically a drug called methadone. Now, methadone is kind of interesting because it bonds to the same opiate receptors that the other opiates do, but it does not give that feeling of euphoria and relaxation, at least not for most people. So the idea here is that perhaps instead of having to handle both physical and psychological detox at the same time, what we can do is put people on methadone and then let them deal with the psychological impact of not getting high without having to also deal with the physiological impact. It's sort of the equivalent of having people stop smoking by giving them nicotine patches. We'll give them nicotine and therefore satisfy the physiological cravings. And also, nicotine patches, when used as directed, are almost certainly safer than either smoking or vaping, when used as directed. Which basically means more about this later, but it basically means don't use a nicotine patch and smoke, because you're liable to overdose on nicotine, which can and does happen. The problem here, of course, is that, as this parenthetical says, you're merely trading one addiction for another. Another drug that can be used is buprenorphine. This is more of, I believe it's an antidepressant, and it's not addictive. It's not an opiate, but it does reduce the craving so that people essentially don't feel that craving for the opiates that they would otherwise have. In both cases, this should be combined with therapy. This should be combined to try to deal with the psychological reasons that the person started using the opiates in the first place. Because if all you do is deal with the physiological reasons and you don't handle the psychological ones, the odds are very good the person is going to go right back to using the drugs. And quite frankly, this is true for almost all of these substances, probably for all of these, is that in many cases they start or they are made worse by a physical by a psychological problem, by people dealing with things in their life by using these drugs. So it's always a good idea to deal with the psychological as well as the physiological.